So turning to our agenda for tonight, we've got two excellent speakers for you, Grace Blakeley and Jonathon Porritt, who are going to talk about how austerity, inequality, and the climate crisis are linked. After hearing from them, we'll have a joint Q&A session and we'll enable the chat function so you can type in questions for them, and I'll put as many of those questions to the speakers as possible. After that, we'll share some information about how Umbrella is bringing people together for a rally and People's Assembly on November the 2nd in London. But before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to share a few thoughts from an Umbrella perspective on tonight's topic. Many of us in the climate movement have watched with horror over the past year as global temperatures have soared past the 1.5-degree limit that was supposed to keep us safe. It's now beyond doubt that we're heading over 2 degrees of warming in the 2030s. And for over 30 years, we've seen how governments have proven incapable or unwilling to rein in fossil fuel use. And more recently, we've listened to arguments of the so-called realists who urge caution and the need to bring everyone along on the journey to net zero, lest we create social unrest. Well, I've got news for the realists. Because unless we stop burning fossil fuels within a very short time scale, social unrest is a given. Global heating will destroy our ability to grow food. Extreme heat and starvation will force hundreds of millions from their homes, and millions will die. Social and economic collapse will follow. How do we know this will happen? Because it's already happening in some of the poorest countries in the world. And as far as we can see, our politicians have no real plan to protect us from this. Our political system is broken and the public knows it. Hence the overarching theme for this series of Zoom calls. But what determines whether a society under stress is tipped over into chaos? How can we best prepare our societies for what is coming? Well, it turns out that the level of inequality is one of the key determinants of societal resilience. The more unequal a society is, the less resilient it is to the kinds of stresses that we're about to face. Unfortunately, for us in the UK, we've experienced over 40 years of governments slavishly following neoliberal economic policies. And as a consequence, we've become a grossly unequal society. Britain now has the highest rate of homelessness in the developed world, and over a quarter of our children are living below the poverty line. This is a direct consequence of the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of the very few and their corrosive effect on our democracy and our media. And worse news still, psychologists tell us that the global adoption of neoliberal policies has not only resulted in greater inequality, but also greater public acceptance of that inequality and even support for it. People literally no longer care. No wonder the far right is doing so well. So Umbrella, the organisation behind Just Stop Oil, Youth Demand and Assemble, was formed earlier this year with the understanding that we all need to come together across movements to respond to this unfolding political, social and economic crisis, to push for system change and to resist the inevitable rise in fascism. So as we approach the first budget from a Labour government in 15 years, we're being softened up for yet another dose of neoliberal austerity. We brought together two excellent speakers to help us make sense of all of this. So first up, we've got Grace Blakeley. Grace is an acclaimed economic commentator, journalist, and author. Her latest book is a devastating critique of late-stage capitalism, laying out why the system isn't actually broken, but it's working exactly as planned. So thanks very much for joining us, Grace. Over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many of you here to discuss some of these ideas. I'm going to change a little bit how I was going to start out, because I want to pick up on something that that we just heard in the introduction, which is this idea that people don't care. And I think this comes across a lot. This is an attitude we see a lot in activist circles, because so many of us are used to kind of being so distressed by the things that we're seeing in the media, whether that's around climate, conflict, inequality, whatever, that we are stirred to action. And we think, right, we need to kind of come together and start to organize to try and fix some of these things. So when we see other people around us not reacting in those same ways and seeming to kind of just sit back and accept what's happening, it can make us feel kind of alienated from everyone else in the rest of our society. And that only gets worse when we start to see things like the rise of the far right, people organizing actively against us to try and stop us from doing what, we know ourselves to be doing, which is, fighting to try and make the world a better place. And to understand why that division has happened, we really need to understand the dynamics that underpinned the rise of neoliberalism itself. Because I don't think the issue is that people don't care. The issue is that people don't really know what to do. A lot of people do care, but we live in these isolated, atomized, individualistic societies in which we confront the organized power of our elites, of the establishment, of those who control most of the resources in our society, those who control political power. We confront that entrenched establishment power as isolated individuals. We confront it basically on our own. And when you feel like you are completely on your own, and you are confronting this this kind of establishment, this status quo that is really embedded and is based on a huge amount of power that is wielded by those at the top of society, you become disempowered. So this is when we see people becoming apathetic, not wanting to get involved in politics, just thinking politics isn't for people like me. I'm just going to sit back and get on with my life. Or the other thing that we see happening is people responding to that sense of disempowerment with rage. It's like, I have no control. I feel like I have no control over the major decisions in my life, because in some ways those decisions have kind of already been taken for me by someone else. My work, I'm controlled by my boss. I am controlled like within society by these politicians who aren't accountable to me. And there are all of these subtle ways in which your behavior is kind of monitored and pushed in certain directions by the kind of institutions that we have in this society. And some people respond to that sense of disempowerment with rage, with anger, with kind of fighting back and rebelling against the system. But because they don't have this understanding of what it means to kind of exercise your power collectively, because they've been raised in this world of kind of rampant individualism, that rage is expressed in individualistic ways as just one person or a group of isolated people raging against the system and saying kind of burn it all down. And often that comes out, that the agency that they feel they lack is discovered by basically trying to exert what little power they have over people even weaker than them. And that's where you start to see the rise of the far right. It's not just about austerity and public services not working. It is this kind of outburst and outpouring of rage from people within a society where basically the vast majority of people have very little power within their lives, let alone over society as a whole. And they take out that sense of disempowerment and the kind of shame that comes along with it through kind of anger and through often conspiracism and all these kind of crazy sorts of things that we start to see on the right. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here, how we got to this world, because promoting this culture of individualism was kind of the central pillar of the neoliberal movement. Most of the policies that we saw from the 1980s onwards under governments like, for example, those of Margaret Thatcher, but also Tony Blair, Reagan in the US, Pinochet in Chile, all of these governments were united by this commitment to this ideology that we call neoliberalism. Now, they presented this ideology as we have this commitment to free markets, and we think the state has gotten too big and that we need to reassert the power of free market competition, basically, because that's going to be more efficient, more effective. It's going to make society function better. It's going to, revive entrepreneurship, innovation, all the things that make capitalism great. But what's interesting about what actually happened under neoliberalism, and this is what my book, Vulture Capitalism, is about, is that the state didn't become smaller and the market didn't become freer. Instead, the state stayed largely the same. In some cases, it grew, and its power was reoriented away from supporting workers and towards supporting capital towards supporting bosses, big businesses. So rather than having investment in public services and proper social security, you have periodic bailouts of financial institutions, subsidies, tax breaks for big corporations, and obviously the brutal power of the state used to crush any protest. So state power didn't shrink under neoliberalism. And this is the kind of the lie at the heart of this, markets versus states debate. Instead, we got a state that effectively became captured by vested interests, by the interests of capital. And at the same time as you had that kind of state capture happening at the top of society, this was, basically a way of kind of protecting those at the top from competition. So it really undermines this idea that neoliberalism was about kind of promoting free markets. You also had the growth of kind of monopoly power and the growing strength of kind of big corporations and big businesses within free markets. So those markets became less free. Instead of having, competitive businesses all on a kind of relatively small scale fighting with each other to gain market share, you have these huge monopolistic corporations that have so much power, they don't have to worry about competition. They have very little accountability. It effectively means they're able to do whatever they want. So you had this kind of limit on competition for big businesses and powerful governments. If a big, powerful corporation gets into trouble, it knocks on the door of a politician that is probably donated money to, and it says, I need a bailout. So for those at the top, competition is not something that they really have to experience very much, thanks to these neoliberal policies that are about protecting those at the top. At the same time, the neoliberal revolution was also about subjecting everyone else to immense amounts of competitive pressure. So if you're at the top, you're insulated from competition, but everyone else is forced to compete much more ruthlessly and rigorously with one another just to survive. We see this with the kind of decline of public services and the reduction of kind of social security and welfare payments, which basically means that if you don't go out there, work hard, get a job, and put your all into kind of succeeding in that area of life, then you're going to find yourself basically in poverty. And that was an intended element of the kind of reforms that we saw under neoliberalism, because there was this intention to force us to want to compete with each other much more. We also had things like, the privatization of social housing, privatization of pensions. All of these things were about encouraging workers, people, to see themselves as kind of mini capitalists who own assets and derive their sense of wealth and power from the ownership of those assets, rather than from the wage they get from working, in their day-to-day jobs. And that wage historically was obviously subject to kind of contestation and struggle through the labor movement. So by taking that away and encouraging instead people to compete with each other, to get ahead, to identify with the interests of, financiers and property owners by owning their own homes and having their own private pensions, you undermine that spirit of organizing that had made the labor movement and workers pretty strong in the past. So what neoliberalism gives us is this really warped society where most of us are basically struggling to get by. And in order to kind of get ahead, we feel as though we have to compete with everyone around us. But those at the top face very little competition and very little accountability. And the example I often use to illustrate this point, and it's very pertinent when we're talking about climate politics, is the example of Boeing. Now, Boeing is a massive multinational corporation. It has very little competition. It's got one major competitor, Airbus, and it relies on immense amount of support from the American state. And this all came to a head when in 2018 and 2019, you had 2 plane crashes involving Boeing planes, which killed nearly 350 people. Later, a few years later, you will have seen that also a door blew out of a Boeing plane mid-flight, and now its workers are on strike. But back in 2018, 2019, Boeing was working to kind of manufacture this new plane, the 737 MAX. And it was doing so on the basis of this kind of philosophy of we have to maximize our profits and we have to cut costs in order to do so at every stage. And what that meant was crushing the labor movement within the company, adding in layers and layers of management, and relying on a very close relationship with the American state, which provided it with protection, with subsidies, with tax breaks, and also basically allowed it to regulate itself. The FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Authority, so Boeing was being regulated by a unit of the FAA that sat inside Boeing and whose workers were being paid by Boeing. So this close relationship with the US state, combined with its push to maximize profits, led Boeing to create this plane, the 737 MAX, which was fundamentally unsafe, and it nosedived out the sky in these two different plane crashes. It was later found to have committed basically a conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and yet still, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it managed to get a bailout through the American state and ongoing protection and contracts with the American state, despite the fact that it had basically been found to have committed criminal actions in allowing this plane that its senior executives knew were unsafe to go to market. Today, it is a massive arms manufacturer and is involved in many of the horrific conflicts that we're seeing around the world. And its workers are currently going on strike after several whistleblowers who had come forward to say these planes are unsafe were basically pushed back and, beaten back and told to, that their opinions weren't valid and it didn't matter. So these kind of disasters, Boeing being involved in geopolitical conflicts, climate breakdown, and then these two horrific plane crashes alongside all of the other flaws that have been recently found to be in its planes. That isn't just the free market gone wrong. This is a monopolistic firm working with the state to achieve its interests and crushing the organizing power of workers in the process. This kind of illustrates the lie that underpins this free market ideology that says we live in this free market capitalist system, we have democracy, which means that, we can hold our politicians to account, and we have the free market, which means that big corporations can be held to account. Actually, there is no accountability for those at the top. And there's too much accountability, too much competition for everyone else. We are forced to basically compete in order to survive. And that has been a direct strategy by neoliberal politicians who want to strengthen the power and the ability to collaborate of those at the top and weaken our ability to collaborate. Neoliberalism came about during the 1980s after we'd had this long trend of increasing worker power and actually the increasing power of social movements, of the environmentalist movement, peace movement, feminist movement, all increasingly kind of coming together to say we want to build a democratic economy. It was in the 1970s that workers at Lucas Aerospace in the UK, another aerospace company, said that we don't want to manufacture weapons anymore. We actually want to build a worker-owned, democratic company that is producing socially useful technologies. So they put out word to all of the workers at Lucas Aerospace and said, submit your ideas. What emerged from that process was the Lucas plan, which basically said, look, this company is struggling, it's about to close down. Why don't us workers take over and reorient production to socially useful, environmentally friendly technologies? What happened to that plan? It was crushed by the neoliberals, because that movement was never about promoting free markets. We don't have free markets. We don't have a smaller state. What it was about was crushing collective power, fragmenting society so that we all adopted this competitive individualistic ideology that encourages us to see each other as enemies and constantly compete with each other, while those at the top are collaborating like never before. They have a level of solidarity that is unparalleled with each other across the public and private sector, between different institutions. And we face that power as these isolated, atomized beings who really struggle to work together to imagine how we could begin to exert our collective power to resist it. And that's why I think we have this issue of people don't care. It's not that people don't care, it's that they feel hopeless. If you ask the vast majority of people in society, do you think, the economy needs to change to make it more fair? They'll say yes. If you ask them, are they worried about climate breakdown? It's more than 70% of people say yes, they are worried about climate breakdown. A significant portion of those people say they are so worried that it affects their daily lives. People do care. The issue is that they feel completely lost and disempowered when they confront giants like ExxonMobil, which knew about climate breakdown in the 1970s and took all of its funding out of the climate research team so it could donate to groups spreading climate denialism. They feel intimidated by governments that have made it their job to crush protests, to crush the labor movement. And they see their lives as this struggle against everyone around them to try and get to the top. And this is replicated in so many institutions, from work to school, even to online dating and to social media, where our worth as human beings is kind of tied to where we sit in this competitive hierarchy. So we feel alone, we feel isolated, we feel like we have to fight against everyone around us. And we face this really strong, collaborative group of powerful individuals and institutions at the top of society that are able to wield that power against all of us as little fragmented individuals. Now, this is why collective power is so important. It is the one thing that genuinely scares those at the top, is when we as individuals are able to move beyond our individuality and actually come together in groups, whether that's at the level of our communities through community organizing, whether it is in our workplaces through organizing in the labor movement, whether it is us coming together on the streets to try and hold politicians to account and make our feelings about policy and about so many other areas known, whether it's direct action, whether it's divestment movements. All of these things terrify the establishment. It's why we got neoliberalism in the first place, because during the 70s, these movements were very, very powerful. They needed to find a way to fight back against that. So how do we come to, how do we kind of start to reestablish that kind of power that was so ruthlessly and effectively crushed by neoliberalism? Well, it has to start with these questions of individualism. And this is why we have to kind of learn to approach people where they're at. We have to be able to understand that when you're talking to the average person, the idea of fighting back against climate breakdown by organizing with other people seems kind of absurd, because there's no other areas of their lives where they're organizing with other people to do anything. They're probably not in a union. They see politics as this kind of individualistic relationship where they go and vote once every 4 years for an individual person who they either like or dislike. Through almost every area of their lives, this individualism is going to be reinforced really, really effectively. And it's just not in their imagination, it's not in their vocabulary, it's not in their, framework for understanding the world to think, oh, I'm on my own right now, but if I organize with other people like me, then I would have the power to be able to change things. So that's a really important message to be able to communicate. And it starts by meeting people where they're at, which is often this place of, I'm so overwhelmed by all of the insanely, huge and intense challenges that we face as humanity right now, but I just don't feel able to confront them on my own. And I think that's why it's so important to give people opportunities to engage in loads of different forms of collective organizing. So yes, that can be showing up to a protest or taking part in a direct action. It can also be something as small as joining a local campaign to protect your library, or to protect green spaces, or to protect the right to roam. All of these little entryways into collective organizing give people a sense of their power when they can come together with other people and resist that coordinated power that's exercised over them by those at the top. So I think I'll stop there, because I think I've taken up probably a bit too much time already. But I'm really interested to hear all of your questions about how we begin to do that. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Grace. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yes, just a reminder to everybody, if you've got questions for Grace or Jonathan, who's up in a minute, do type them into the chat, and I'll put them to them in a bit when we've heard from Jonathan. So Jonathan is an eminent writer and environmental campaigner with a wealth of experience gained over 40 years. He's been co-chair of the Green Party, director of Friends of the Earth, chair of the UK Sustainable Development Commission, and a co-founder of Forum for the Future, to name just a few. He's now focused on intergenerational justice, helping to support young people facing the twin crises of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Jonathan tackle the rather tricky subject I've set him, which is to weave together all of these disparate influences. So thank you, Jonathan, for coming, and over to you.
Thank you, Mel. And delighted to have a crack at the challenge you've given me. Grace has just made it a great deal harder, of course, by very cogently reminding us that neoliberalism, hegemony of neoliberalism, as you describe it, lies at the heart of so many of the issues that we're facing today. And it is such a deep incumbency. It is so powerful that sometimes we do feel impotent. We do feel unable to respond in the way that we might want to. And I think that's prevalent across many, many groups of people in society. So to sum it up, as you do, Grace, this notion that collective organization and action is one of the ways of addressing that sense of powerlessness and finding common cause amongst all the different areas that we're involved in. I agree with you. That is absolutely crucial. I keep asking myself why we haven't yet quite found that common cause. What is it? We find lots of reasons to come together and do things collectively, but we don't find, apparently, the reason to come together and address these deep, deep structural issues in the economic system, the neoliberal meta system that we are all subservient to. And that's really difficult, really difficult. And for me, it often goes to why organizations that I have been involved in and love dearly have never done this deep connecting story, never actually done the hard work to make their passion as effective as it needs to be by connecting more deeply. So the real test of this for me was last week, WWF International, an organization with which I used to be involved as a trustee in the UK and ambassador and all the rest of it, brought out its latest Living Planet report, more accurately described as its Dying Planet report, that told us somewhat predictably that 70% of the world's biodiversity had been destroyed between 1970 and 2020. So 50 years to wipe out 70% of biodiversity. And of course, underneath that word biodiversity lies all the life support systems on which we depend, et cetera, et cetera. I read the report, reluctantly, I have to admit, because I knew it would tell me nothing new, and it didn't. And it barely went out of its way to make any connections with the economic system that has caused this 70% loss. It could hardly even summon enough energy to talk about the problems associated with economic growth at all costs. And if we continue to peg progress for humankind to the inevitability or the automatic requirement for economic growth, then we all know we'll just get closer and closer to the abyss every year. And that made me think more deeply about WWF International and indeed many environmental organizations, because this is really a time of reckoning for environment groups. We have failed comprehensively. We failed to do what we were all set up to do in the 20th century in one way or another. We've not stemmed the pattern of destruction. We've not stopped the loss of biodiversity. We've not stopped the buildup of greenhouse gases. We've not stopped the amount of plastic in the environment. I don't want to sound too gloomy at this point, but we've not got to the heart of any of these big challenges. And I feel and have felt for a long time, and I wrote a book called Capitalism as If the World Matters back in 2005. I feel that this is because we won't connect. We won't understand what these deep issues really are. So when you look at the Living Planet report, there's a sort of assumption that this pattern of abuse going on is amendable, correctable, that if we just put our minds to it, we can make decision makers in both the private and the government sectors do it better, pursue their model of growth better, more intelligently, less destructively. There is literally no recognition that the abuse of the natural world is inherent within our current model of neoliberal capitalism. Literally nothing, not a single sentence that would direct your attention to that really rather obvious point. And although this is not WWF's concern, there is literally nothing in there which would remind people that the abuse of other people is inherent within today's model of capitalism, as is obviously manifesting now all around the world in increasingly grotesque patterns of racism and oppression of minorities and so on. And elsewhere, there's nothing in NGO land that would suggest to you that our abuse of other creatures is inherent within today's model of capitalism, as in the death of 85 billion domestic animals every year to sustain our current pattern of animal-based protein-intensive diets. So even now, there is a quite extraordinary reluctance to confront these deeper connections, these deeper issues. It is, honestly, it is really remarkable. And of course, from the perspective of campaigners today, and I'm thinking now, particularly through the eyes of Just Stop Oil campaigners, I've been doing a lot of work recently with some of the young Just Stop Oil activists, interviewing them, talking to them about their perceptions of this. They don't struggle to connect what they're doing with the model of capitalism that we have today. They don't find that difficult. They don't find it difficult to track that back to where this particular model of extractive kleptocracy emerged from. They'll quite readily go back to an understanding of how colonialism and slavery in particular embedded patterns of wealth creation that were inherently abusive of the planet, of people and other creatures. That's sort of in there, in the mix, as a deeper understanding of why we're now confronting some extraordinary forces in our lives today. And I really admire that not automatic, but readiness to go into some of those harder places. I have to say that's not the case with an awful lot of mainstream environmentalists today. They still jib at the idea that we've got to dig down deeper into these root causes of what it is that at the moment is surfacing through one environmental crisis after another. So for me, I'm really intrigued by this. I do think it's a time of reckoning for environment organizations. I'm slightly unnerved by the lack of readiness to accept that this is a time of reckoning, and that if we don't start connecting with these deeper issues, perhaps just connect with the issue of the fact that if we remain wedded to this particular pattern of economic growth, then it's game over for humankind. It's not game over for the future of life on Earth, by the way. Don't worry about that. That will be perfectly happy to be getting on with itself without humankind on the planet. But it's certainly game over for whatever model of progress we might seek to entertain. Incredible that there's still really deep reluctance to engage in that. And incredible, there's still deep reluctance, as I know Grace has commented on in her work before now, deep reluctance to engage in issues of social injustice. And the degree to which any aspirations we might have for various green environmental causes are completely dependent on our simultaneous ability to address structural inequity in societies, both rich and poor. I maybe shouldn't hold out for this for too long, because I've been waiting around for a long time to see some of this deeper awareness about the connectivity between social injustice and environmental sustainability being brought together. But it's pretty weird to see how reluctant environmental organizations are, for instance, to embrace the absolute necessity of some kind of redistribution of wealth, of some kind of, let's use the euphemism of fair taxation that would give people an opportunity to see more of the proceeds, the wealth that is created in the world, directed into things that would really make a difference in people's lives. And it's very hard to see where that comes from. I'm only raising all of those problems because I've really enjoyed working with JSO, Just Stop Oil activists, and seeing that those connections are there. I was fascinated when Just Stop Oil and others decided to create Umbrella, and we're going to hear in a moment about the Umbrella March coming up in November. And Umbrella being a place where a combination of different priorities can be brought together, whether that's through youth demand and the extraordinary work that it's been doing with Palestine Action and Free Palestine and other organizations involved in the campaign against genocide in Gaza, or whether it be through Assemble, trying to look at different ways of bringing forward plans for more deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies, whatever it might be. And in there somewhere, as Mel knows well, an idea about a sort of Robin Hood type way of going after the super rich in our society who now lie at the heart of so many of these different problems. If you look at Umbrella, it's kind of, it's a manifestation of what needs to happen to bring all these different causes together and to do it in a way that embraces different generations. Youth demand is unapologetically about tapping into the anger, fury, indignation, deep compassion of young people today about what happens in a world where genocide can apparently be licensed by the UN and by international forces, and where the oil and gas, the fossil fuel incumbency is licensed, literally, to continue to extract its raw materials out of the ground, even though we all know now that indicates very little prospect for future generations to lead the kind of lives they might want to lead. Youth demand is going after that in a very direct way, which is fantastic. But we also have to address some of these issues about our democracy and the degree to which now our democracy is at ever greater risk. To me, therefore, that whole story about democracy, the whole story about our judicial system, there's a lot of work being done by Defend Our Juries, a demonstration next week on Thursday, which I hope many of you are now aware of, where I hope hundreds of us will be gathering outside the offices of the Attorney General in Westminster to protest about Labour's inability to think differently about political prisoners in the UK. Unbelievably, 50 people here in the UK, peaceful protesters in the UK, have been jailed since July. And a lot of them have been jailed because they weren't actually allowed to explain why they'd done what they'd done. They weren't able to talk about their motivation. They weren't able to talk about climate science. They weren't able to summon expert witnesses. The judges in those cases said that is irrelevant to why you're in this court here today for whatever it might be, criminal damage or whatever. So that's the bit we also have to tie in here, which is we're talking about democratic renewal. We have to talk about our ability to protect the judicial system against some of the outrageous attempts of the previous government to suborn and undermine that judicial independence, and, question mark now, the readiness of Labour to go along with all of that as our new government with a huge majority, but as of now not evidencing any real signal that it wants to send different messages to the world about its recognition of the right to protest and the importance of these democratic safeguards. So next Thursday, October 24th, which happens to be United Nations Day, is important. And from there, we'll all, I guess, move on to think about the Umbrella March, where we'll be given another opportunity to think about what Grace described as these collective actions, where we can express ourselves in ways that speak to our own passion and sense of justice but in so doing reach out to others who are fighting different battles in different corners of this blighted society of ours. Mel, I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll have a chance to pick up on some of this in Q&A.
That's great. Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks for giving a shout out to all the things that we're involved in over the next few weeks. That's great. So we've had a load of questions for both of you. I'm going to start posing them. So a couple of questions about neoliberalism, and I'll probably wrap them up together. So someone has suggested, how is it possible for us to imagine a future that's better without neoliberalism, given that before we had neoliberalism, the world was a lot worse off. Basically, healthcare, living standards were a lot lower. So, can we imagine that life would be better without neoliberalism? So I'll start with Grace, and maybe Jonathan would like to have a go at that one as well.
Well, life before neoliberalism was better or worse depending on who you are. If you were a wealthy or kind of middle-class professional person in the global north, then you have massively benefited from the changes brought about by neoliberalism. You've been able to buy your own house, which has increased dramatically in value. You've got a big pension pot worth millions. You have tons of consumer goods to choose from. You have, wealth and power and influence, even if there are lots of other kind of challenges going on in the world. But let's think about all the things that were lost for the vast majority of people with the transition from social democracy to neoliberalism in the global north. So we had social housing that was available for millions of people across the country, which meant that you could stay in the same house that would be, potentially passed down for generation. You had security of tenure, you had low rents, you had that protection, which meant that basically no matter what happened, you were going to be able to keep a roof over your heads. We had much higher levels of investment in our public services, which, meant the levels of kind of investment in private health insurance were much lower. We have this deep and profound crisis in the NHS that's taking place right now as a result of this long period of cuts, which is basically putting a lot of people in the position of dying on waiting lists because they can't access treatment and they can't afford to pay for it privately. If you think about, the levels of collective support for people that existed and under those systems, they were much, much deeper and wider and broader, whether we're talking about the welfare state or whether we're talking about unions, community, solidarity, all of these institutions that people were involved in that gave them a sense of belonging and purpose and solidarity. Now, obviously, the world has improved in a lot of ways since the 1970s. Thank God. We've had lots of kind of technological change. There has been a big shift in terms of geopolitics. We still basically live under American imperialism, but the balance of power at the level of the global economy has started to shift. And that has created a lot of change for the world. But even at the level of the global economy, prior to the rise of the Washington Consensus in the 1980s, it was a lot easier for poor countries to basically borrow, to invest, to develop kind of infant industry and move away from this kind of neo-colonial relationship with powerful countries. And then once you had powerful states pushing capital mobility, which meant money could go all around the world, forcing open all of these economies so that multinational corporations could come in and exploit their resources, preventing them from, having workers' rights, subsidies for food, etc. Life actually became very hard for a lot of people. So imagine if we'd had the level of technological change that we've had, and actually, arguably a technological change that was much more focused on the issues that are really affecting people's lives, but alongside those institutions that were destroyed with the rise of neoliberalism, those institutions which are based on, basically kind of solidarity and collective power. That's the kind of vision for the future, which is a combination of kind of innovation with the democratic control and ownership of resources and our collective power to kind of govern the institutions that, most affect our lives. And when we look at the kind of low-level, small-scale examples of where this is happening today, it's almost like this system has cracks that exist within it. And when we kind of peer through those cracks and see the light that's coming through from the other side, we can see, right, what might it look like beyond this system? And I give loads of examples in my book, but, the Lucas plan that I talked about was one. There is the cooperative movement that we see all around the world, the factory reclamation movement, in which workers are basically taking control of factories in which they formerly worked, the community wealth building movement, movements around indigenous rights and justice that are actually at the forefront of protecting the climate. All of these movements are based on us moving beyond this culture of individualism and neoliberalism, and rebuilding those links of solidarity that have existed at a lot of times in the past and that can continue to exist again. So it's not really right to say that everything was better for everyone prior to the advent of neoliberalism. What's fascinating as well is if you go and talk to, for example, people in mining communities whose lives were destroyed by Thatcher, and who, would have benefited from a kind of just transition of the kind that we're talking about today. They say, I hated going down the mines. That sucked. The relationship with bosses was exploitative. But what we had then that we've completely lost is a sense of belonging, community, solidarity, that we were working together to fight for, our rights, to fight for our community, and ultimately, the labor movement fighting for a better world. And that is something that has had a massive impact on our lives. It's why we've got this epidemic of mental ill health. It's why so many people, as we've said, feel so lost, isolated, and alone. So if we're able to kind of combine the levels of technological change that are making lives better around the world, yes, undoubtedly, with a collectivist approach, as opposed to this individualistic approach to institutions, then that gives us a much healthier society.
Thanks, Grace. Jonathan, I don't know if you want to have a go at that one, or shall I pose you another question?
You can pose me another question. I'm very happy for Grace to fill that space. I mean, the question itself reminds me that we're so vulnerable to the propagandistic skills of today's neoliberal titans. I mean, the period of capitalism that existed between the 1950s and the 1970s was so much better than the period of capitalism that we've had since the 1980s. I'm not saying it was everything we'd probably want in life, and all of the characteristics about inherent abuse of the planet and people and animals and so on, they were all there in that model of capitalism for sure, but they absolutely weren't there to the extent that they are today. So I keep going back to the horror story of Mrs. Thatcher's There Is No Alternative. That little bit of propaganda, boy, they have worked that patch so assiduously for so long. And a lot of people see that now as the truth. And it ain't.
So thanks, Jonathan. Here's a question for you. Much of the environmental movement has failed to recognise the economic model that underlies the growing environmental crises we face. So what about politicians, many of whom must understand the problems and fail to act in the general interest of humanity? How can we exert influence on them? What kind of politics do we need?
You're stretching my readiness to be compassionate and respectful with that question. I'm sorry, you really are. I mean, my experience of politicians does not take me in the same direction. And right now, I'm absolutely fascinated at the degree to which politicians are so scared of knowledge about climate and nature impacts that they won't go there. Mm-hmm. They won't look at it. They know that in that box is a whole set of insights into the inherent unsustainability of our model of growth and progress and all the rest of it. And they can see that climate change is getting worse, but they don't want to know how much worse on a sort of regular, ongoing basis. They know that box contains almost unmanageable risks to the sense of themselves as mediators and good decision makers in a society that is increasingly divided and ill at ease. So they don't go there. They don't want to know. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing to me. And one of the things I've seen is that they will resist any attempt to allow the whole truth about climate breakdown to be unfolded in front They will just resist it, because that knowledge then becomes unmanageable in their own terms. So forgive me, I've just said what I've said because I'm not persuaded that our politicians are in the good place that you think they are. In fact, I think they're so deeply immersed in this defensive refusal to listen, so deeply trapped in a fossil fuel incumbency, that may be another issue to explore later, that they are not able to represent people's concerns and worries about the future in the way that you imply.
Thanks, Jonathan. It just prompts a very direct question from me, which is, given what you say about fossil fuel incumbency, and given what we know about the influence of super rich donors on politics, would removing political donations, having publicly funded political parties, something of that nature, limits on campaign spending, or do you see, the citizens' assembly movement and what Assemble is trying to do, giving kind of direct deliberative democracy a chance as the way forward?
I think all of that is really crucial. It's not quite as bad yet in the UK as it is in the USA, where the opportunities for billionaires to buy politicians is now legal and limitless. It's bad here, and I would love to see much more draconian restrictions on the amount of money that people can give to political parties, because I think that would help the vitality of our democracy. That's just one part of a much bigger story about democratic renewal, but boy, do we need that big story. We sure do.
Thank you. Grace, here's one for you. Do you see degrowth as crucial to success in combating inequality and climate collapse? And if so, how do we move from collective action in local or workplace issues upward to addressing global structural change at the level of the WTO, IMF, UN, etc.?
I think this is a really important question. And the issue is not growth, degrowth, it's moving beyond the growth paradigm altogether. Because you have to think about why our politics is structured around this idea of growth. And it's really about, basically who benefits from growth. Growth is essentially about capital accumulation. It's about making sure that, the investment opportunities that are required for businesses to grow and expand and boost their profits exist. In a growing economy, those opportunities do exist. In a stagnant economy, they don't. So the growth paradigm is not, as we are often told, about making sure that there's a bigger economic pie for everyone, because that's not what we get. We, often get very unequal growth, where those at the bottom get very little and those at the top get a lot. The issue then is what we're measuring. Because if we're measuring growth and we're saying we want not growth, we're still stuck in the same growth paradigm. What we need to be measuring are things like, well-being and whether or not we're staying within our environmental limits, all of these sorts of things. The issue then is how we get there. Any kind of policy solution that we're talking about, any paradigm shift, we often kind of think the liberal view is to kind of think of change as emerging from a policy shift, right? So you elect a politician, they get into government, they do the policies that they promised you, and then the world changes. But actually, this is a really flawed way of looking at political change and looking at policy. And it's kind of not really how we've seen policies change throughout history. If you look back to kind of the era of mass politics, and this is, again, something that shifted during the neoliberal era, we went for an era of mass politics with kind of mass organizing, civic engagement within political parties, a much kind of broader and deeper culture of engagement in politics, through to what political scientists called the cartelization of political parties. So political parties turning into cartels, pushing away their mass memberships, and just focusing on kind of colluding with each other to limit the possible range of policies and make sure that members don't get to have a say. So, if we want to revive that kind of, a more diverse policy agenda within our politics, because at the moment it's very narrow. Both political parties basically offer us different versions of the same thing. We need to think about how to revive that age of mass politics when politicians were just as scared of voters and of people organizing as they were of the people giving them the money. Why? Because we were organized. Again, neoliberalism was about making sure that that organizing was fractured and our collective power was undermined so that we couldn't pose a threat to them anymore. So, you know, even when we're talking about policy change, that has to come from the bottom up. We can't just expect suddenly all the politicians to turn around and realize, oh yeah, you know what, we have been doing the wrong thing. We need to start, you know, doing degrowth or whatever it is that we think that they should be doing. Any shift has to come from a change in the balance of power within society. And that literally starts with all of us getting involved in some form of organizing, getting involved in some form of, you know, political organizing in our workplaces, turning up to a protest, getting like to know these issues and starting to talk about them in other areas of our lives. All of these things are so critical to be able to imagine any of the kind of policy shifts that we want to see.
Great, thanks, Grace. And that leads me on to what I think will probably be our final question, and for Jonathan. Could it be that the drastic diversity of values prevents we activists from finding the common ground on which we can build a massive single movement? How do we find the value which is common to the majority?
Yes, I guess if we knew the answer to that question, Mel, we'd be feeling somewhat more confident about our future, respectively from the progressive kind of politics we're talking about and for humankind as a whole. I think we've probably now landed one or two really deep conclusions about what needs to happen to counter the stranglehold of today's neoliberalism. And it's a weird kind of thing. It's almost as if we were beginning to map out what I've heard one or two people call as green popularism. So it's not obviously not green populism, as that would be highly dangerous and threatening and all the rest of it, but green popularism, where we do stake a much bigger claim as to the changes that would make a big difference in people's lives in a short period of time and simultaneously serve these bigger issues of greater social justice, decarbonization, restoration of nature, and so on. And I can see people fumbling for that now. I can see us recognizing that if we don't get closer to what it is that people desperately need to make their lives better and more secure, and as Grace was saying, closer to some of those models of solidarity that we once took for granted, then they're going to be rejecting pretty much everything when it comes to climate and nature. The Climate and Nature Bill, for instance, just back in Parliament now, thank heavens, needs to emphasize that recognition of how it has to translate into real things in real people's lives in their communities. For me, that's probably now the thing that we must all really focus on. There are lots of ways we can do that. We haven't been doing them as well as we should. It would make a difference. Whether it'll make a difference fast enough to rescue us from the stranglehold of the fossil fuel incumbency, I don't know. I can answer that question in a few years' time now.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. So I think we'll wrap it up there for the Q&A. And next we're going to Grace and Jonathan, thanks very much for your contributions. You're welcome to stay. We're just going to hear now from Sam, who's going to talk about our Day of Action on November the 2nd. So over to you, Sam.
Hello, everyone. My name's Sam, and I'm from the Umbrella March team. I'm also from Assemble, which is great to hear that mentioned. And I also identify as a climate justice and nature justice campaigner. So everyone knows that politics is broken, and Grace and Jonathan have done a fantastic job today of like articulating really well what and why that is. But I'm going to talk briefly about what we're going to do about it, and it's more of a starting point. So we need a cross-movement revolution, as I think's been mentioned already, and that means we need decisions making processes to empower ordinary people to decide their future, citizen-led assemblies, and we also need a revolution for system change, which means that we need everyone from the left, all the different movements, to come together we need the climate movement, but not just the climate movement. We need the equality movements. We need the democracy space movements. We need the Palestine movement, all to come together in collaborating to build this revolution. And the thing is, it's not easy because the left is always divided, right? We've heard earlier that there's a constant battle and polarization in the media influencing, oh, these people are like this and these people are like that, and sort of like really pushing us apart. But whilst that's happening, we all know that we're all normal people and we need to like collectively find our power and our agency. So that means that to build that sort of coalition, it starts by meeting people where they're at. Okay, so we've got a set of demands and they're quite broad, and that is because we want to bring this coalition together and start as we mean to go on with this umbrella coalition. So those demands, you might have heard about them, I'm not sure, but I'm just going to sort of repeat them. So the first one is stop arming Israel. The second one is tax the rich to end equality. Third one is just stop oil by 2030. The fourth one is replace the House of Lords with a House of the People. So that's making it legally binding and we're part of the decision-making process. And then end political corruption and investigate the real criminals. So that is the 5 demands. And what we're going to do is a march on the 2nd of November, Saturday, 2nd of November. Now, some of you might have heard or read about it. Initially, we were going to do a march independently, but since then, we found out that our friends at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign are also doing, obviously, an anniversary big march on the same day. So in solidarity with them, we've pivoted because we need to be dynamic in these times. So what we've decided to do is create a block within their march. And this block is obviously called the Politics is Broken block. And we're inviting all the different coalitions to come together. And then we're not just marching. So after the march, we're going to invite everyone back to a venue nearby where we're going to have a rally. And then we'll be able to hear from different groups, from different agencies of what people are working on. Then we'll also have food. So pre-vegan banquet. Then we're going to have a people's assembly where people can be part of that decision-making process and get to know how that process works. That will be where we're going to be co-creating a participatory budget, because we know that the way that the government are going with their budgeting right now is terrible, right? And so we're going to give ourselves back the power in making those decisions where the priorities should be. And then after that, we're going to have a bit of a party, bit of music to relax and connect with each other, right? Because that deep work needs to happen. So this is just a starting block, I should say, of something much larger. And it's a long-term thing because this isn't going to happen overnight. It's a big bit of work. So that is the sort of strategic thinking. And in terms of what we're asking, we're inviting people to come, obviously, bring an umbrella as part of the umbrella march in the block, bring your placards, bring your banners, whatever they say, because it's a coalition, so there'll be various different people bringing their different messages. And what else? We will have we've got an action sign up network page where you can find out more information and let us know that you're coming. There's also some key roles. So if you're up for supporting, like in a supportive role that day, we're looking for people to help with the setup and takedown at the venue beforehand and after. And we're also looking for people to become facilitators of the People's Assembly. So we can offer training, that's no problem. It's free, it's online, and it's on the 27th of October. So if you're interested in finding out about that, please do tick the box on the Action Network form to say you're interested in doing one of those roles. The other role, finally, is outreach. So when we're doing that work when we're on the march, we're inviting people to take flyers with them and talk to people in the block, beyond the block, whoever's walking past, to connect with them and let them know what we're doing and invite them to come to the after party as well. I think that's everything. Oh, I should say, if you are coming to the after party, which you're very welcome to, you would be really best to register online, basically, because we need to know numbers to make sure that we make enough food. So again, all of the information, I'm hoping that one of the team can share the link in the chat so that you have everything that you need. There's one master live document, and as things change, it gets updated. And then there's the form and the ticket that I've mentioned. We're also looking to collaborate with more groups, of course. We're openly inviting as many groups to come together as possible. So there is also that invite if you'd like to invite a group that isn't already signed up. I should also say that we today are in conversation with the climate block of the march, who's organised by the Climate Justice Coalition, and we are collaborating with them. So they will be on the day joining our block, so that it's big and everyone understands that this is a coalition that we're building. So it's really exciting, and yeah, it's the start of something quite interesting. So I'm going to pass back now to Mel. Thank you so much.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. And you should be able to see in the chat, there's a sign-up link for November the 2nd, Action Network form. And there's also the link to book your tickets to the after event. So they're in the chat, you should be able to see them. So I think that's about it. I think the last thing that we want to do, though, is to ask you, from what you've heard, how you would like to support this event. So I think there's a poll that's going to go up, which will ask you to just fill in. And when you've done that, I think we'll say that's it for tonight. And thank you very much for coming.